Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I am the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by Khaled Beydoun. He is professor of law at Wayne State University. He's also the associate director of civil rights and social justice at the Damon Keith Center for Civil Rights. He's the author of the books American Islamophobia, Understanding the Roots and Rise of Fear, and most recently, the new Crusades, Islamophobia, and the Global War on Muslims. Professor Beydoun, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So, I was thinking about where we could begin, and it strikes me that your new book is sort of an extension of what you wrote about in your first book. Your first book focused on the United States. Your second book expands to a global focus, but both books have at their core the American global war on terror that began after September 11th, which I know was formative for you. So I think a logical place to begin the conversation might be to take us back a little bit to what happened after September 11th, 2001, the climate, the experiences of American Muslims then. Because one of the things that you do so well in these books is you take us beneath media narratives to focus on the people whose lives are actually affected by the things that states do in the name of combating terrorism and radicalization. Radicalization, right? Put that in quotes. So yes, I think perhaps we could start with the beginning of this thing called the global war on terror, the reverberations of which are the subject of both books.
Yeah, I think that's a good sort of like summation of the thread between the two books, is you had this sort of formative, transformative moment, the 9/11 terror attacks, which gave rise to the war on terror. And again, it was a global war on terror. It wasn't intended to be confined to American boundaries and the American experience, which was the focus of the first book. But when writing the first book and then talking to people about the book and touring the book, I realized that I was basically just doing a disservice to the broader sort of enterprise of this new global war on terror by not fully addressing what was taking place in places beyond the United States, Europe, the Middle East, Asia, South Asia, East Asia, so forth, beyond and in between. So when speaking to people who had experienced the war on terror in dramatically different ways, being somebody who was very keen on using, I guess, my academic platform to be a public sort of commentator on these issues, I wanted to give voice and, sort of amplify the experiences of people, places like India and China, France, Sweden. And that's sort of the spirit of this new book.
Yeah, so I want to go through the global Islamophobia that you discuss in the new book. Let's stay for a moment on the United States. Perhaps you could tell us a bit about the environment after 9/11 for American Muslims. This was your kind of coming of age. I mean, I think that a lot of people, I sort of remember this. I was in 7th grade at the time. You definitely remember this, but we live in the United States of amnesia. We forget the kind of explosion of bigotry and hostility and nationalism and militarism that happened instantaneously. Like, it didn't begin then, as you point out. You discuss in American Islamophobia the long roots of Islamophobia in America, but it was a terrifying moment, I imagine, for every American Muslim.
Yeah, I was a young man making my way through school at that point. And, in a matter of a day's time, the entire feel and sort of like tenor of the country had changed dramatically in the direction of demonizing people who looked like me and believed like me as the new enemy, right? The primary enemy. And you saw that being manifested in the rise of hate crimes, hate incidents. Our mosque was vandalized in our community. Muslim women who wore the hijab were being attacked and accosted by hate mongers very prolifically, right? The best way to characterize it is this was a moment of not only state-sponsored response to what had taken place in New York and Washington with the terror attacks, but society, right? This was societal vengeance where lay people on the ground, average Joes and Janes, were identifying and attacking anybody who looked Muslim or what they thought and imagined
Mm.
looking Muslim would look like. So it was, yeah, it was this new moment where people like me became the new political and geopolitical enemy of the United States, the strongest country in the world. So it was very frightening, unsettling, especially being Muslim American myself. Like, how do you sort of reconcile these two identities, which after 9/11 was said to be at civilizational odds and war?
Yeah, and I mean, you do discuss the fact, as I said previously, this has long roots, right? The United States had its Muslim boogeymen, Saddam Hussein, the Ayatollah beforehand. Of course, Edward Said had written Orientalism long before about the way that the kind of clash of civilization lens was present throughout Western media, but it just sort of was on steroids after 9/11, where like Samuel Huntington went from rejected but like a little bit fringe to like the dominant analysis of the way the world looked.
No, definitely true. I think that so the neoconservative government, which presided over the Bush administration, had catapulted, the likes of Samuel Huntington, Bernard Lewis, Fuad Ajami. I guess the best way to think about them or to title them would be these are neo-Orientalists who believe that the West, as sort of this monolithic, aligned, geographic slash civilizational entity, as a consequence of 9/11, even before 9/11, like you've stated, was at sort of like this predictable pathway towards perpetual war with the Muslim world. And 9/11 legitimized that for the government. And it catapulted the likes of Samuel Huntington to be sort of like the mouthpieces of the day. But you're right. I think there was always Muslim boogeymen before 9/11. And you've mentioned some of them, right? Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, Ayatollah Khomeini with the Iran hostage crisis that really, penetrated the American imagination in 79, Saddam Hussein throughout the 80s and the 90s. But at that juncture, these were secondary villains, right? In the American sort of geopolitical Rolodex. The Soviet Union was always the primary villain. And when the Soviet Union declined, there was a vacuum, there was a void. 9/11 had elevated this motley crew of Muslim villains into the primary villains in Al Qaeda, the Taliban, these transnational terror networks, which commit the 9/11 terror attacks and the range of other terror attacks that took place during that time. They sort of occupied number one, public enemy number one, after the Soviet Union created that void. And the 9/11 terror attacks sort of opened the door for this full scale crusade against Muslims and Islam on a global level.
I think it's shocking in retrospect almost to realize the size of the gap between the number of people who perpetrated 9/11 and the number of people upon whom vengeance for 9/11 was exacted, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Al Qaeda, in retrospect, I mean, even the Taliban were not responsible for 9/11, right? It was a tiny, tiny, tiny group of people. And
Yeah.
then the Bush administration's rhetoric, I mean, the global war on terror expanded to country after country after country. I think Brown University's Cost of War project has estimated the number of refugees and people killed as a result of the post 9/11 wars, and it's millions upon millions upon millions.
Yeah, what's really troubling about sort of the response with the war on terror is that sort of it conflated an entire faith group, an entire global population of 1.7 billion people, with the very horrific and atrocious acts of a handful of people. And even when you look at the demographic origins of the culprits of the 9/11 terror attacks, these were generally Saudi men. I think the majority of them were Saudis. They originated from Saudi Arabia. They sort of adhere to this very fringe, overzealous iteration of Sunni Islam called Wahhabism that again has roots in Saudi Arabia. But none of that was identified really closely by the Bush administration because that careful, narrow framing of who the terrorists would have disrupted the economic and political alliance of the United States with Saudi Arabia, right? So they didn't want to do that, obviously, because we have exclusive rights to mine oil in that nation. And like you said, there was no direct sort of nexus between Al Qaeda and the Taliban, right? Taliban were the sort of ragtag political movement in Afghanistan who might have given safe haven to Al Qaeda terrorists. I think that was the link. But the Bush administration swiftly commenced war in Afghanistan in the days after. But it didn't matter, right? These sort of like careful, meticulous connections didn't matter in the imagination of the American government, and definitely not the people, because the people just wanted some sort of vengeance, right? Well, I think what is distinct about American culture and American society at large is that, it has a hyper violent sort of trajectory, and a lot of that is rooted in American history, where sort of mobilizing the thirst for violence on the part of the American people is not hard to do, especially in the wake of massive tragedy like the 9/11 terror attacks.
Mm.
And one quick note to make mention of is, look, it's important to think about the global war on terror as sort of a politically and economically expeditious instrument that the US government used to expand its, interests, not only in the region, the Middle East, but globally speaking, right? So it was an imperial tool, an irrational tool that enabled the expansion of American empire.
It's so interesting what you say about, and so important what you say about the American capacity for violence in that way. It made me think of the response to Pearl Harbor, actually, which was very similar towards Japanese people. And, the desire, when you go back and you look at the US propaganda after Pearl Harbor about exterminate all the Japanese, there are no civilians in Japan, the massive fire bombings of Japanese cities on the assumption that all Japanese people perpetrated Pearl Harbor, right? And that same kind of thirst for vengeance after being attacked that results in the conflation of many, many different people who are completely different from one another into one group of people upon whom it's legitimate to punish for the acts of a small few.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I think, look, if you look at the mass internment of Japanese, the majority of them Japanese citizens, 120,000, I believe it was, Japanese residents of the West Coast were rounded up and placed in internment camps in the wake of the Pearl Harbor attacks in 1941. And the parallels there are so stark that, race and religion both can be used to easily other a people and then demonize a people and then justify very strident and draconian policies, right? That blame an entire group only, along lines of the way they look and how they believe, even though there's no direct connection. In the Japanese case, they were thought to be, spies engaged in subversive, treasonous activity, passing intelligence back to the Japanese Empire. And there was no evidence of that, but they still sort of justified the mass internment of a people. And you saw a similar thing take place in the post 9/11 context with this new architecture of policies that were being put in place to police Muslims, not only here in the States, but globally.
I think that the United States definitely has not had a reckoning with the amount of destruction that was wrought in the wars that we waged post 9/11. I mentioned some of the tallying of the number of refugees that have been generated that has been done recently, the utter wrecking of Afghanistan and Iraq, and not just starting with Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, it's just an extraordinary level of brutality that this country is directly responsible for.
Yeah, brutal in a range of ways, right? I think that the Iraq war is even more nefarious and illegal than the war in Afghanistan, right? And the number killed in Iraq, the number is anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million of innocent civilians who were killed by a war that had no justifiable legal basis. But it was also brutal on the American end. In this book, this new book, I speak to a gentleman who lives 10 miles away from me in a largely white working class community who had, because of no other economic options at that time, chose to enlist in the Iraq war. And it really destroyed him. And I met with this guy, sat with him for coffee, suffered from a range of diseases, mental health, destroyed his family life, came back and is essentially jobless now, has no one tending to him. So it was brutal on a range of levels, right? It was brutal to the people who were sort of targeted as prospective terrorists in places like Iraq, but it deployed masses and masses and masses of young American men to fight a war and essentially sacrifice their lives and their futures for a war that was entirely baseless, unjustifiable, and illegal.
Hmm. Going back to what you were saying about this capacity for violence, it's interesting. You have this quote from him where he says he's describing why he joined up, and he said basically the only thing I knew was that we had been attacked, and I wanted to defend us,
Yeah.
right? And it makes you understand that if that is the limit of the information that someone is given, someone from perfectly decent motives can end up being enlisted to take part in just horrific atrocities. Of course, there's the same thing that is being told to Russian soldiers now, and their sort of illegal war is, well, you have to defend the homeland.
Yep.
And so all these terrible things can be done by people who are just given this very small amount of information. This group of people did this thing to us. Now we have to go and defend ourselves.
Yeah, it's really frightening how very good men, like the man I spoke to in the book, can be made into monsters with a scintilla of propaganda.
Mm.
Right? When I sat across this guy, him and I could be friends. We like the same things. We live 10 miles away from one another. He was sort of an alpha male, right? And I say that sort of like in a benign way, where it was like, his objective to sort of just take care of his family, take care of his community. And he had a love for his country. Those are beautiful things. Those are things to be commended.
Mm.
But the way in which the media was sort of disseminating this violent, vile information about Muslims, people like me, somebody who sat across him at the table, mobilized him to want to, enlist in a war in a place that he had no knowledge of. He just knew that he wanted to defend his country. He wanted vengeance, and that these Muslims, these Arabs who were a world away, were the culprits of this 9/11 terror attack. So he was ready to volunteer his body. And I think that when I met with him, and this guy didn't go to college. He's not an educated guy, right? But when he came back from the war and he had nothing to come back to, you could tell that he felt deceived by this country because the tone of his allegiance to the country had changed dramatically, right? He was skeptical, he was suspicious, and he didn't have the same love for country that he did before he left for that war, because he realized how the war had broken people like him and how it sort of told lies about people like me. He'd grown to call a friend and somebody that I still speak to today.
What's interesting listening to what you say there is that you could be quoting directly from someone I interviewed a couple of months ago who was a Vietnam veteran who described almost the exact same experience of being told. He said he grew up in the 1950s on American World War II films where we were the heroes, and he signed up to join the Marines in high school, and he went to Vietnam and he found himself killing Vietnamese peasants and supposedly to stop communism, and came back just thinking this country has lied. It came back a totally broken person. So this is a very common experience of these myths, this otherization process that can just shatter upon realizing that human beings are on the other side of this.
Yeah, I think it was Albert Camus who once wrote that it's rich men who send poor men to fight their wars, right? And you see this with the Vietnam War, contemporary wars like the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, where these are poor people on either side killing each other to advance the interests of wealthy men who would never dare, to sort of expose themselves or their sons or their loved ones to the specter of war.
Now, you mentioned earlier the sort of media messages that a guy like John, the veteran you talked to, would be fed. And I think one thing that it would be good to discuss is the way in which Islamophobia, Orientalism are kind of buried, or not very hard, but implicit in so much across Hollywood, across the press, from American Sniper to Call of Duty. I think Call of Duty recreated the assassination of, who's the Iranian general?
Soleimani?
Yes. So you reenacted in the latest Call of Duty game, right? Yeah. It's all through various pieces of American media.
Definitely. I think that, so when you meet somebody like John, or when I go to college campuses and I meet young, white, non-Muslim men and women who sort of adhere so strongly to Islamophobic views, I can't blame them. It's a natural sort of perspective for them to have, because every sort of channel and medium of importance in the United States, whether it be television or Hollywood, whether it be conservative, centrist, and even sometimes liberal news, is peddling this idea, peddling this image that any mention of Muslim identity is somehow connected to this specter of terrorism, right? So terrorism and Muslim identity in the contemporary political, popular, and entertainment sort of parlance are virtually synonymous, right? Whether you're watching Fox News or whether you're watching, Homeland on Showtime. So you can't blame young people for making that correlation. You can't blame, any sort of like well-intentioned individual who doesn't have direct access to Muslim communities or knows anything about the Islamic religion or the broader Middle East region to believe that these Muslim folks are inclined toward terrorism. So I'm not somebody who approaches individuals who have negative or even malicious views of my faith as evil, wrongdoing, big-headed, flat-headed people. Because part of being American in the last 20 years since this war on terror has been launched is to be Islamophobic.
Yeah.
In the same way that being American in Jim Crow America, when segregation was the law of the land, was to be anti-Black.
Right.
More than just culture and policy, I think it's even deeper than that, that these sort of definitive eras or moments recreate what it means to be American. It's baked into the very existential matter of what identity mean because of media, because of culture, because of law. I talk about this dialectic of Islamophobia in my work, right? And how that sort of reshapes American identity in the mirror opposite direction of, this reconstructed Muslim villain who was the very opposite of who we want to be and who we are as American people.
I see. So that opposition is central, you're saying, to our self-definition.
Very much, yeah.
Mm.
I mean, another way to look at it is like how Edward Said frames Orientalism, right? Theorizes Orientalism. The identity and sort of character of the West or the Occident is shaped and curated in opposition to how we reshape the Orient, right? And that's also true for, American Orientalism or American identity with regard to Islamophobia.
So the definition of the West includes like the West is not them. Right? Yeah. And Americans, we're defined by being not other people.
Yeah. And I think, for instance, like, look, you may remember the anti-Sharia movement, right? There were laws being enacted in states across the country a couple of years back before these anti-critical race theory bans, where states were looking to ban Islamic law. And the very language of this legislation would say exactly what you just said. We're not them. Our values are different. They're trying to take us over. So there's sort of like, civilizational binary that now is being echoed across Europe in places like Sweden with the rise of, the Sweden Democrats, obviously in France, which has, long been a hotbed of Islamophobia, in that continent, Germany, the UK to an extent.
Yeah.
So you see this dialectic being replicated in countries across the world.
Yeah, this is what I want to get to, because this is the core of your new book. I mean, in the United States, we might think that some of the worst explicit post 9/11 Islamophobia has been dialed down a little bit in the mainstream press, as we have found some new villains of the day in the form of China, Russia, critical race, right? Whatever, transgender people, right?
I'm a critical race theorist too, so I'm getting in both directions.
Oh, right. Okay, so yeah. But one of the things that you've focused on, I think that this book is so important, is that you say that essentially, like, the U.S. war on terror planted this seed of Islamophobia that has now spread all across the world, from China's persecution of the Uyghurs to India to France. So perhaps you could talk about how the U.S. global war on terror has now contributed to this massive global problem.
Well, obviously it's, we all know that the United States is the primary global superpower, and the American war on terror was meant to be a global crusade where then President Bush used that word crusade and specifically sort of posed to nations across the world, you're either with us or against us, leveraging American might, against smaller countries who want to align with the United States for a range of economic and political reasons. So there was this sort of flexing of American might to force countries across the world to flank alongside the United States in this sort of like, search of these Muslim biggie men in their midst. So as a consequence of that sort of like geopolitical framing, the global war on terror provided countries across the world with a new language, for how to frame and to profile their Muslim populations, new policies and programming, an entire sort of lexicon and architecture to police, persecute, and punish Muslim populations. So you saw as a consequence of this direct ultimatum and this new sort of language and policing framework, countries across the world, China, for example, which had always had issue with its Uyghur Muslim population, a struggle over land essentially, before 9/11 was profiling and characterizing the Uyghur Muslims as this sort of savage, unruly band of subversive criminals who would not sort of like bend or capitulate to the broader Han supremacist Chinese communist project. After 9/11 and after Bush visits China in October, you see an acute market shift of the regime doing away with that language and fully adopting the American language of counterterrorism, counter-radicalization. The Uyghur Muslims have a direct link with ISIS, Al Qaeda, and these transnational terror networks, which enabled them. It provided them with carte blanche to persecute and crack down on these Uyghur Muslim populations in ways that were unprecedented, in ways that aligned with the greatest superpower in the world that was democratic in nature. So you could do what you want to do, but escalate it under the auspices of the war on terror. Same thing happened in India, right? So Hindu supremacist government comes to being in 2014, staunchly anti-Muslim, adopts a American-style lexicon and strategy towards persecuting Muslims. Same thing across, sadly, in some Middle Eastern countries where Muslim organizations are being framed as terrorists, across Europe. So, in summary, the American war on terror basically extended almost carte blanche to governments to crack down on their Muslim populations in ways that were unimaginable before, and that were sort of extended by a country that is, globally regarded as being not only the world's most important democracy, but the sort of protector of civil liberties and civil rights.
Yeah, there's all this opportunistic and hypocritical American outrage about China's hideous persecution of the Uyghurs. And then, yeah, as you say, when you read the Chinese government's justifications, they sound like the Bush administration. It's incredible. They say, well, we're undergoing this de-radicalization project because of the serious threat of radical fundamentalist Islamic terrorism.
Oh, very much so. There was a program coming out of China in 2016 called Destroy All Terrorism in the Xinjiang Region, something very nefarious like that. Once you read the fine print of the policy, it sounds a lot like the counter-radicalization policy being used by the Obama administration. Even before that, Prevent, which was a similar policing program used in the UK. The language, the framing of prospective terror threat, the process in which a Muslim becomes a radical, is almost adopted wholesale by the Chinese government from American and British origins.
Mm. You mentioned Obama there, and I think one of the important points is that the United States government's policies are not just pernicious under our overtly Islamophobic presidents.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that one thing I try to do with my work is to demystify this idea that Islamophobia is only a culture or a perspective or a legal system coming from conservative or right-winged elements. It might be more explicit when it's coming from the Republican Party, but Democrats and liberals have been just as wed to Islamophobic sort of currents and attitudes as the right has been. And President Obama spearheaded and implemented this counter-radicalization program, which had a destructive impact on Muslim communities like the one I live in here in Detroit, places like Minneapolis, Los Angeles, Boston, that pierced into the heart of Muslim geographies in ways that were even more destructive than FISA surveillance, the Patriot Act, and programs that were being brought by Republican leadership. And in my opinion, I think counter-radicalization still stands as the most pernicious structural Islamophobic program ever instituted by an American president. And it was brought forward by President Obama, who was widely regarded as being one of our more progressive presidents. So that tells you a lot about how Islamophobia, from a systemic standpoint, can very much be ushered in and amplified by progressives or liberals.
Can you say more about this? Because I think when people hear counter-radicalization,
Yeah.
some of them who have not been on the receiving end of it might think, but what's wrong with that? Surely your radicalization is the one thing that we want to prevent.
Yeah, of all sorts, right? But the issue with radicalization, but I'll break it down. Radicalization is only a concern that is made synonymous with Muslim sort of practices, right? So it has a direct effect of eroding core constitutional rights like the free exercise of religion, free speech. So I'll give you an example, right? So for me, I'm a law professor. If I start growing a beard or going to a specific mosque, or fasting on Ramadan, stuff that is entirely protected by the Constitution, the First Amendment, right? I have the right to freely exercise my religion as I see fit without governmental encroachment. However, these behaviors that I just mentioned that are protected by the First Amendment from a counter-radicalization standpoint would be viewed by the FBI and their local informants as activities that might give rise to me becoming a terrorist, right? Entirely benign, innocuous religious activity.
Mm.
In addition, let's say somebody like me who is a critic of the war on terror, puts up a tweet or a post saying, I think that the war in Iraq is entirely illegal or unjust. I think that the Swedish government looking to shut down mosques in the center of Stockholm or the French policy of banning the headscarf is a entirely racist and xenophobic measure. That kind of free speech, which is protected by the First Amendment, might be read by an FBI officer or informant as a symptom of me radicalizing.
Mm.
So that's the danger of counter-radicalization policies, that it's essentially punishing activity that is entirely protected by the First Amendment and other constitutional safeguards.
And you say it's structurally Islamophobic in part, I take it, because it is associating one's level of devotion to one's religious faith with radicalization, right? The more serious and committed a follower of Islam you are, the more you are suspect as a, quote, radical.
Oh, of course, yeah, and that's exactly it. It has a direct correlation with piety. So the more pious one is and the more, one is sort of more outwardly expressive with their faith, the more inclined the FBI and their proxies are to police them.
I think it's worth mentioning that even in countries that pride themselves on their liberalism and tolerance, you find the same kind of risk of Islamophobic violence. You talk about New Zealand, a country that I would classify as priding itself on its tolerance. And of course, that's the site of one of the most hideous acts of Islamophobic violence in recent history.
Yeah, I think that in largely liberal democratic states like New Zealand, Sweden, Australia, and in France, you have, very concerning strains of Islamophobia that rise from, these vacillating movements of populism where politicians or pundits in these places use Islamophobia as sort of a strategy to galvanize and mobilize followers and to sort of justify things like economic decline, rise in immigration, declines in the population of whites living in that country, right? Quote unquote, white anxiety, things of that nature, to sort of spur this frightening rise of vigilante violence. And I think what happened in New Zealand is a very stark example of that with what was happening in Australia. The killer comes from Australia. In Australia, you have really concerning currents of anti-Arab, anti-Muslim politicking and white supremacist factions that rise from that really motivated this guy to hop on a flight and kill, I think it was 50 people in 2 mosques in Christchurch in New Zealand. And lesser things have taken place in recent time, right? So in places like Sweden, I think it was 2 weeks ago, this staunch and ardent Islamophobe, Rasmus Paludan from Denmark, right, engages in similar sort of, violent Islamophobic theater by burning mosques and public squares. And that kind of activity has been sort of encouraged and in some respects incentivized by the rise of Islamophobic populists like the Sweden Democrats in that country. So it's critical to understand that there are sort of like liberal democratic roots that can give rise to concerning fronts of Islamophobia because they open the door for populists to become very politically influential and potentially overtake political power. And that's definitely the story of Donald Trump here in the United States, too.
And the level of dehumanization can reach just such terrifying extremes. That guy, the Christchurch shooter, he live streamed it like he was playing a video game, just not viewing people as people at all. And we might say, well, that man is such a hideous sociopath, such an extremist. But then truly, when you look at United States policy, formal policy, the use of drones, right? Drone strikes on weddings. You could look at the Christchurch massacre and say, my God, how could someone kill people like they were ants or like they were video game characters? But I'm sorry, the Obama administration's actions in the war on terror, when you look at some of the drone strikes that were carried out, I would say morally are an inch away or not even that.
Yeah, you said something earlier which was really prescient and lined in with the conversation we're having now, in that younger generations are being socialized to engage in a form of impersonal violence that has become really concerning. I mean, with video game culture, for instance, all these young people play these video games like Call of Duty, where the villains are brown or black, Muslim and non-white. And killing is sort of like baked into their daily existence by playing these video games, watching these movies, and sort of interacting with social media, where they're interacting not with real people, but with avatars that they can freely curse out and threaten in a very non-intimate way. The sort of like conventions of war today sort of follow that same construct, where you're not seeing your rival anymore. There's no boots on the ground anymore. You're pushing a button or launching a drone a world away that's destroying entire villages or bombing weddings. So it's only logical in a natural progression to sort of birth this new age line of killers who engage in that very same activity of not viewing their targets as fully formed, fully fledged human beings, but non-beings, right? That can easily be killed and mowed down in mass, because that's how we've been socialized to behave. And it's easier to do so when the people don't look like you, right? And it's not only a Muslim problem. You might recall this mass shooting in Buffalo, where a young white man drives up to a largely black grocery store, and he does the same thing as the killer in New Zealand, right? He records it, live streams it, and kills tons of black folks in similar fashion.
Well, and the El Paso killer who said there was a Latino invasion of Texas.
Yep.
Well, one thing you talk about in your conclusion is the standards of the varying levels of humanity that are applied to different people, because you discuss the war in Ukraine, and obviously you're very upfront about the fact that the war in Ukraine is an illegal act of aggression. It's a hideous atrocity. Yeah. But you draw our attention to the fact that Ukrainian victims are viewed differently. They are given in the US press and by the US government an elevated status.
Oh, definitely so. Yeah, I think that, and I appreciate you prefacing the fact that I view the war as being illegal, because I get a lot of slack,
of course,
for drawing these comparisons, right? And it's not a comparison to slight or critique the Ukrainian struggle or people in any way. It's just sort of like a meta narrative that highlights the double standards drawn along lines of race and religion, where the American public at large and American news outlets of importance and newspapers of record, they elevate the sort of human value of the Ukrainian people and Ukrainian victimhood far beyond the kind of attention and value that's attributed to individuals in places like Palestine or Kashmir or Yemen, and now the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria, which aren't a war, right, but which are a human crisis nonetheless, in ways that are not entirely drawn to race. I think whiteness has a big part to do with the story. Some of it is American interest in Ukraine, obviously, and the alignment of NATO. But race and religion has a big part to do with it. And I think even the psychological affinity that, most Americans see when they see a Ukrainian war victim or a refugee or a displaced individual, they look like them and they look like their children. And they're able to sort of physically map that person in ways that are far more intimate than somebody who was classified as a villain and as the other. And that's why you see Ukrainian flags being waved on the homes of Americans in ways that only Palestinians or Iraqis or Kashmiris can only hope or dream that could be the case for them.
Well, early in the war, there were even some anchors, some loose-lipped anchors in the news media who would say things like, this is happening in a a European city where you just don't expect it.
Yeah.
Like this implicit assumption that some populations, they are almost like natural refugees, or it's like their destiny, or to have their cities destroyed. Like that's a normal or natural thing that they should be used to. And there's all these, this was true in Vietnam too, where there was this idea that Asian people don't mourn their children in the same way. Like life is cheap.
Wow.
There are all these myths about like, they're not affected the same way that we are by the loss of life.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that about that was said about Vietnamese people. Oh wow.
Yeah, well, the idea that in East Asia life is cheap. They don't look at like they have a Buddhist tradition. They, all this stupid stuff about like when their children die, it's not as bad as when our children die.
Oh wow. No, I mean, I think the Ukrainian issue is very complicated for me because drawing these comparisons, might sort of like render the message that I'm devaluing their struggle or devaluing the experiences of, Ukrainian refugees scattered across Europe and the world at large. But the policy even reflects that, right? There was a recent policy out of Germany, and I think Denmark, if I'm not mistaken, where they were absorbing new Ukrainian refugees and simultaneously looking to send home Afghan refugees, right? And I think there was even some politicians who might have said, they might have been some right-wing politicians who echoed that same idea that, look, we should absorb Ukrainian refugees because they're of the same civilization as us, right? It's implied in the media, but it's also explicated in the political discourse.
We have a vastly greater moral responsibility to absorb Afghan refugees in the United States because we're part of the reason that the country is starving to death.
Exactly.
Maybe take care of the victims of your own crimes first.
And I think that's a responsible way to look at, the way you go about your refugee and immigration policy, right? If your policies have been destructive on a nation and created refugees, then that might create a greater sort of priority or responsibility on your behalf to tend to the refugee crisis that you've created. We didn't go to war with the Ukraine, right? So you could make a distinct case for absorbing Ukrainian refugees.
I want to conclude here with the way that you counter the dehumanization that you document by telling people's stories and going around the world and humanizing people, forcing us to look directly at and hear about the lives of those who are left out of mainstream accounts. So perhaps you could tell us whose stories you want to be told and you are telling in this book.
Yeah, I think for me that's the greatest thread or dimension of this book is that it's a memorialization of stories that would otherwise not be heard if a book like this didn't exist. And it's humbling to have the kind of, I guess, reach or platform that I have to be able to give voice to Uyghur Muslim refugees living in Turkey, Syrian refugees living in the United States, displaced Rohingya mothers who have lost their children, working class and indigent French, Algerians living in the ghettos of Paris, not only telling their individual stories of struggle against Islamophobic policy, but entwining all of these distinct narratives into a cogent sort of tapestry that provides a real portrait of what global Islamophobia looks like. And it's not all bleak. It's not all negative, right? That's one thing I hope people walk away, read the book, walk away with is the idea that these are real stories about resilience, about people who have really clenched on to their spirituality and the strength they draw from their spirituality in ways to endure after, experiencing considerable tragedy. One story that really stuck with me, I'll share this, is the woman on the cover of the book. She's 17 years old. Her name is Muslima. She's a young Uyghur Muslim girl living in Istanbul, and she lost her father. She's not sure if her father is killed or still locked away in a concentration camp. And just hearing stories like that, of, especially from young people trying to make sense of their lives, far away from home, far away from loved ones, for me, just sort of like entrenches this obligation to tell their stories in ways that, I'm best able to.
Yeah. You have this great little epigraph at the beginning that says, this book is about people, not myths. And I like the way that sums it up because, once you've destroyed the myths at the foundation of Islamophobia, you start to see the actual people in their full humanity. And you say there that it's not entirely a pessimistic or negative book. I think that's very true, because once you can let go of the simplistic, fear-based worldview of Islamophobia, and you start to see people in all of their diversity and richness, once those spectacles of ideology are taken off and you see the human beings, the world becomes a much better place. It becomes a less terrifying place. You're not afraid of terror all the time. You get to be friends with your neighbors, right? It makes the world better. We can get along a little more.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that, another sort of objective of mine was to sort of do away with this idea that Muslims were only Arabs and Middle Eastern people, right? So sort of deconstruct this racial caricature of who Muslims are. And that's why I intentionally chose to place a Uyghur Muslim woman on the cover of the book. It's not somebody who you would imagine would fit how you think about Muslim women.
No, it's kind of a manifesto for humanity. I like that. So the book is The New Crusades, Islamophobia and the Global War on Muslims by Professor Khaled Beydoun. Thank you, Professor Beydoun, for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.